In the shadows of the Appalachians, a cruel legacy emerged: women born without eyes, the most tragic face of consanguinity after generations of incest. Our dark tale commences in 1923, deep within the heart of Tennessee's remote Appalachian Mountains. This was an era when those mountains served as natural barriers, cutting off entire communities from the rest of civilization. In these lands, forgotten by time and rarely reached by the law, one family became the epicenter of a genetic tragedy destined to echo for generations. The Caldwells were known to local residents as the people of the shadows. Having settled in the mountains since the late 18th century, they occupied an isolated valley far from any urban center. Led by patriarch Jedediah Caldwell, the family survived on subsistence farming and hunting, fiercely resisting any attempt to integrate with neighboring communities. Yet geographical isolation was only part of their problem. The Caldwells nurtured a deep contempt for the outside world, fueled by old family stories of persecution and injustice. This self-imposed isolation cultivated the perfect environment for a practice that would become their darkest legacy: marriage between close relatives. "Pure blood keeps the family strong," was the mantra Jedediah repeated to his children and grandchildren. This mistaken belief, in truth, was not uncommon for that time and region. Many isolated Appalachian communities, by necessity or tradition, practice marriage between cousins. But the Caldwells took this practice to extremes rarely documented. In 1925, Marion Caldwell, Jedediah's daughter, gave birth to a girl named Eliza. The child's father was her own first cousin, Thomas Caldwell. The infant arrived with a disturbing peculiarity: where her eyes should have been, there were only small, empty cavities covered by a thin layer of skin. The midwife who assisted the birth, one of the few outsiders ever allowed on the property, was horrified. To the Caldwells, however, the child's condition was attributed to evil spirits or a divine curse. News of the child born without eyes eventually reached Dr. William Forrester, a physician from the nearest town. Intrigued and concerned, he attempted to visit the family to examine the child, but was met with pointed shotguns and threats. The doctor, however, did not give up easily. For the next 5 years, he meticulously documented the rumors and reports about the Caldwells that came his way. In his diary, discovered decades later by researchers, Dr. Forrester wrote, "I grow increasingly convinced the Caldwell condition is not the result of a curse, but of union between individuals of close blood relation. Science is just beginning to understand the dangers of such unions, though isolated communities remain ignorant of these facts." In 1931, another birth within the Caldwell family drew notice. Martha Caldwell, Marion's cousin, gave birth to twins. One girl was born with the same condition as Eliza, completely eyeless. The other had eyes, but possessed other physical deformities, including cleft fingers and a severe curvature of the spine. Upon learning of this new case, Dr. Forrester wrote to the Tennessee Health Department, warning of a potential public health crisis. His letter, preserved in the state archives, contains the first documented mention of what would later be called Caldwell blindness. He wrote, "We witness here the tragic result of isolation and ignorance. These children are victims not only of their physical conditions, but of family practices that perpetuate and amplify congenital defects through generations." The authorities' response was slow and inadequate. In 1932, a health officer was sent to investigate, but like Dr. Forrester, was prevented from entering the Caldwell property. The official report concluded that, lacking direct evidence and out of respect for local traditions, no further action would be taken. This was the first of many systemic failures regarding the Caldwell children. Over the following decades, the family continued their consanguineous marriages in isolation, while the number of children born with severe genetic deformities grew quietly. The Great Depression of 1934 barely reached the region. The few interactions the Caldwells maintained with the outside world, mainly to sell furs and buy essential supplies, became even rarer. The family turned further inward, deepening their isolation and mutual dependence. It was in this context that Jedediah Caldwell, then aged 70, established a rule sealing the fate of future generations: no family member would be permitted to marry outsiders. "The world out there is dying," he decreed. "We will survive only by keeping our blood strong and pure." The Caldwell tragedy was not an isolated event in Appalachian history. Other secluded communities faced similar issues, though rarely so severe. What made the Caldwell case particularly devastating was the combination of extreme geographical isolation, a family ideology actively promoting consanguinity, and persistent neglect by public authorities. Check and see if you're already subscribed to this channel. The Caldwell story reveals a hidden facet of American history, a dark secret concealed in the mountains that will forever alter your perception of isolation and heredity. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters of this exclusive investigation into the deepest secrets of the Appalachian Mountains. The 1940s brought significant changes to rural America, but Caldwell Valley remained virtually untouched by progress. While the nation faced World War II and experienced profound social transformations, the family continued its cycle of isolation and consanguineous reproduction, further removed from society's gaze. A crucial event in 1943 altered the family's fate. A powerful storm destroyed the sole bridge connecting Caldwell Valley to the outside world. Already isolated, the Caldwells were now completely severed from civilization. For most family members, this was not a calamity, but the ultimate blessing, exactly the isolation Jedediah had always desired. By this time, Eliza Caldwell, the first sightless child, was 18. Despite her blindness, she had developed remarkable compensatory senses. Her hearing was so acute she could identify each family member by their footsteps. Her hands, trained to replace her absent eyes, could read the earth's texture to predict weather changes, a valuable skill for a farming family. But Eliza carried a burden beyond her congenital blindness. As later testimonies revealed, she had been chosen as a wife for her uncle, Joshua Caldwell, her father's younger brother. This arrangement, decided in her childhood, was part of Jedediah's strategy to strengthen the family lineage. The marriage was to be consummated upon her 18th birthday, a practice considered abominable even in that isolated region. It was Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt and one of the few who occasionally visited town before the bridge's destruction, who first began to question family practices. During her rare trips, she had overheard conversations about bad blood and genetic weakness caused by inbreeding. These ideas, understood only rudimentarily, planted seeds of doubt in her mind. In the spring of 1943, as preparations for Eliza's wedding began, Sarah confronted Jedediah. "Can you not see you are condemning more children to be born like Eliza?" she reportedly asked. Furious at this challenge to his authority, Jedediah expelled Sarah from the family council. Determined to prevent the marriage, Sarah did the unthinkable. She fled the valley, swimming across the river that now formed a formidable barrier. Arriving in town soaked and exhausted, she sought out Dr. Forrester, who still held an interest in the Caldwell case after more than a decade. The doctor, now elderly but driven by professional ethics, immediately contacted the authorities. Unlike in 1932, the response this time was more decisive. America was at war, and the federal government was exercising unprecedented authority in domestic affairs. A district attorney, accompanied by state police, organized an expedition to Caldwell Valley. The intervention resulted in a violent confrontation. Jedediah and two of his sons were killed in a shootout with authorities. The remaining family members, including Eliza, were removed from the valley for medical and psychological evaluation. The Caldwell property was temporarily confiscated by the state pending investigation. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of the damage wrought by generations of consanguinity. Of the 32 people removed from the valley, 14 had significant deformities. Beyond the known eye conditions, doctors documented severe intellectual disabilities, heart malformations, and various skeletal disorders. A medical report from the time described it as observing the results of a cruel, prolonged experiment on the effects of inbreeding in humans. The Caldwell case quickly became a case study in eugenics, the now discredited science advocating reproductive control to improve the human genetic pool. Unfortunately, the findings were often misunderstood and used to justify discriminatory policies against isolated rural communities. For Eliza and the other Caldwell women born without eyes, the intervention brought mixed outcomes. They finally received proper medical care and were protected from future forced consanguineous unions. However, many were committed to state institutions for the disabled, where they often received dehumanizing treatment. Dr. Harold Jenkins, a University of Tennessee geneticist who studied the case in 1945, was first to correctly identify the specific condition afflicting the Caldwell women, congenital bilateral anophthalmia, the complete absence of eyes at birth. In his study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, he wrote, "The extraordinarily high prevalence of bilateral anophthalmia among Caldwell family women strongly suggests an X chromosome-linked recessive gene, amplified through generations of consanguineous unions. In normal populations, the condition occurs in approximately 1 in 100,000 births. Among the Caldwells, the rate is approximately 1 in 3 female births, an alarming frequency that vividly demonstrates the dangers of prolonged consanguinity." Dr. Jenkins's study was revolutionary, establishing one of the first documented scientific connections between prolonged inbreeding and a dramatic increase in the expression of deleterious recessive genes. His findings would be cited for decades in discussions on public policy related to kin marriage. Meanwhile, the lives of the Caldwell women continued. Eliza, who had never left the valley before, faced immense challenges adapting. Without the familiar landmarks by which she had navigated her environment and lacking the social skills to interact with strangers, she initially fell into a deep depression. It was a nurse named Margaret Wilson who finally managed to connect with Eliza. Through months of patient work, Margaret taught Eliza to read Braille and use a cane for mobility. Gradually, Eliza began to develop a new identity, separate from her family's oppressive traditions. In 1947, Eliza provided a detailed testimony about life in Caldwell Valley. Preserved in the state archives, this testimony offers one of the few windows into the internal life of this isolated family. She described how, from childhood, she was prepared for her role in preserving the lineage, and how children born with deformities were seen as both cursed and special, is marked by God for a specific purpose within the family community. The 1950s marked a new era in the scientific understanding of human genetics, and consequently, in the interpretation of the Caldwell case. The discovery of DNA structure by Watson and Crick in 1953 revolutionized genetics, allowing scientists to begin unraveling the molecular mechanisms behind hereditary conditions like the Caldwell women's anophthalmia. Dr. Richard Harmon, a Harvard University geneticist, revisited the case in 1956 using new theoretical tools. His study of medical records and Caldwell genealogical trees allowed for a more precise mapping of the condition's inheritance pattern. In his seminal article, Patterns of Inheritance in Genetic Isolates, The Caldwell Case, he wrote, "Analysis of the Caldwell genealogy reveals a classic X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. Men, with their single X chromosome, serve as carriers when affected but do not manifest the condition. Women, with 2 X chromosomes, manifest the condition only when they inherit the mutant gene from both parents. In exogamous populations, such coincidence is extremely rare. However, after generations of consanguinity, the frequency of the mutant allele in the Caldwell genetic pool reached alarming levels, resulting in the high incidence of bilateral anophthalmia among family women." Dr. Harmon's work helped partially demystify the condition of the Caldwell women, shifting the narrative from superstition and moral judgment to the realm of objective science. Yet, the women themselves continued to face prejudice and social isolation. In 1957, journalist Eleanor Patterson located Eliza Caldwell, then 32, living in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. Eliza had been one of the few Caldwell survivors able to transition to an independent life after years of institutionalization. With help from charitable organizations and compassionate citizens, she had learned to weave baskets, providing a modest income. The interview Eleanor conducted with Eliza, published in Life magazine under the title The Woman Without Eyes, A Survivor of the Mountains, brought national attention to the Caldwell case. For the first time, the American public had access to a first-person narrative on the effects of extreme consanguinity. "Many people think I was born into darkness," Eliza was quoted as saying. "But I had my own form of light. I knew every sound, every smell, every curve of the valley. That was my world. What truly plunged me into darkness was learning the truth about my family, that we were not special or chosen, as we were told, but victims of ignorance and isolation." The article included striking photographs of Eliza, showing her profile with empty eye orbits delicately covered by permanently closed eyelids. The images shocked 1950s middle-class America, sparking discussions about rural health, geographical isolation, and the dangers of endogamy. Following this report, several surviving Caldwell women began to meet, forming an informal support group. Martha Caldwell, one of the twins born in 1931, emerged as the group's leader. Unlike her sister, who had died young due to heart complications related to her multiple genetic conditions, Martha had survived and developed considerable resilience. Using a tape recorder donated by a local church, Martha began collecting testimonies from the survivors. These recordings, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archive, constitute an invaluable resource for understanding life within the isolated Caldwell community. In one of the most disturbing recordings, Ruth Caldwell, born in 1939 and also without eyes, describes being prepared from childhood to marry her uncle. "They told us we were special vessels chosen to carry the family's pure blood. Our blindness was seen as a sign that we belonged solely to the family, that we should never look to the outside world. We believed it. How could we not? It was all we knew." Have you ever wondered what it would be like to grow up in complete isolation, believing your genetic condition was a blessing, not a curse? Leave in the comments "Isolation kills" if you believe access to education and healthcare could have prevented this tragedy. The recordings also reveal how the Caldwell family developed its own mythology to explain and justify their practices. Women born without eyes were called inner seers, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to those with physical vision. This mystical interpretation served to elevate their status within the family, even as they were prepared for a life of reproductive submission. During the 1960s, the Caldwell case attracted the attention of anthropologists and sociologists interested in isolated community dynamics. Dr. Thomas Bennett of the University of Chicago spent 3 years studying case records and interviewing survivors. His 1968 book, The Valley Dwellers, Isolation, Consanguinity, and Culture in Appalachia, became a seminal work. Bennett argued the Caldwell case should not be seen merely as an aberration or a result of superstition and ignorance, but as the extreme product of social, economic, and geographical forces that shaped many Appalachian communities. The Caldwells represent an extreme, but not unique, case, he wrote. Throughout Appalachia, geographical isolation, poverty, and historical distrust of external authority created conditions for endogamous communities to develop. Combine these factors with a lack of access to education and healthcare, and you create fertile ground for tragedies like the Caldwells. Bennett's work was revolutionary in contextualizing the case within broader sociological analysis, rather than treating it as a medical curiosity or a sensationalist narrative of rural degeneration, the approach that had dominated previous discussions. In 1965, an unexpected tragedy brought the Caldwell case back to public attention. Eliza Caldwell, then 40, was found dead in her Knoxville apartment. The investigation concluded she had committed suicide, leaving a brief note that read, "I am tired of being an example, a case study, a lesson. I just want to be remembered as a woman." Her death prompted a re-evaluation of how Caldwell survivors had been treated by the medical system and media, raising questions about whether constant exposure and clinical analysis constituted another form of exploitation that perpetuated their suffering. The 1970s brought significant advances in the scientific understanding of the Caldwell case, parallel to changes in the survivors' lives. With the development of more sophisticated genetic analysis techniques, researchers at Johns Hopkins University identified the specific mutation responsible for the Caldwell women's anophthalmia. Dr. Michael Stern, the study leader, published his findings in 1973 in the prestigious Journal of Medical Genetics. His research identified a mutation in the SOX3 gene on the X chromosome as the likely cause. The Caldwell mutation, as we are calling it, offers an unprecedented glimpse into the molecular mechanisms of human eye development, Dr. Stern wrote. The fact this mutation is rarely observed in general populations but reached high frequency in the Caldwell family serves as a powerful example of founder effect amplified by generations of consanguineous marriage. The founder effect Dr. Stern referred to is a genetic principle where loss of genetic variation occurs when a new population is established by very few individuals, as when Jedediah Caldwell and his family isolated themselves in the mountains. Combined with repeated inbreeding, this effect can lead to high expression of rare genetic traits, exactly what happened with anophthalmia among Caldwell women. As science advanced in its technical understanding, Caldwell survivors continued their personal journeys. Martha Caldwell, having emerged as the group's informal spokesperson, was invited in 1974 to speak at a rural health conference in Washington, D.C. Her presentation, Beyond Darkness, The Lived Experience of Consanguinity, marked the first time a Caldwell woman addressed the medical and political community directly. In her speech, preserved in the conference archives, Martha challenged the predominant narrative: "You have studied us as specimens, catalogued our deformities, mapped our genes, but rarely asked what it is like to live in our bodies, our minds. We are not just examples of defective genetics. We are women with hopes, fears, and dreams. And yes, we are survivors, not only of our biology, but of a belief system that valued purity above health and well-being." Martha's speech had a significant impact, inspiring a more humanistic approach to studying communities affected by genetic conditions. She was later invited to help develop educational materials about the risks of consanguinity for isolated rural communities. In 1976, a surprising discovery added another layer to the Caldwell history. Historian Robert Williams, surveying a local church archive, found parish records from 1798 documenting the arrival of Ezekiel Caldwell, Jedediah's father, to the region. The records revealed Ezekiel had fled his home county in North Carolina after being accused of unnatural practices, a common euphemism for incestuous relationships. This discovery suggested the Caldwell's consanguineous practices preceded their Appalachian isolation, reversing the previous causal understanding. It wasn't simply isolation that led to consanguinity, rather, the family may have sought isolation to continue practices already considered taboo. Historian Williams argued in his book, Buried Roots, The True Origin of the Caldwell Tragedy, that this broader historical context was crucial. The Caldwells were not simply victims of geographical circumstance and ignorance, he wrote. Their story begins with a deliberate choice of isolation to escape social scrutiny, followed by the construction of a belief system that justified and sustained practices they knew were condemned by wider society. This is not a simple tale of environmental determinism, but of complex interplay between choice, circumstance, and consequence across generations. This historical reassessment sparked intense debate. Some criticized Williams for downplaying the socio-economic and geographical factors that shaped the Caldwell community, while others praised his approach for restoring the family's historical agency. In 1978, a PBS documentary titled In the Shadows of the Mountains, the Caldwell story brought the case to an even wider national audience. It included interviews with Martha and other survivors, as well as doctors, geneticists, and historians who had studied the case over decades. One striking scene showed Martha Caldwell returning to the now-abandoned valley where she grew up. Walking with a cane, she navigated the ground with surprising ease, guided by tactile and auditory memories. "Here," she said, stopping at a specific point, "is where we would sit at night to hear Grandfather Jedediah's stories about our ancestors. He told us we were special, chosen to preserve something precious the outside world would never understand. As children, we believed it was a privilege. Only later did we understand it was a prison." The documentary won an Emmy and generated renewed public interest, coinciding with broader 1970s debates on reproductive rights, consent, and the limits of government intervention in cultural and family practices. For the survivors, now middle-aged women, this renewed attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Several were offered advanced medical treatments, including cosmetic eye prostheses to improve their appearance, though not restore vision. Many, however, expressed fatigue with the continuous public and scientific scrutiny of their lives. Ruth Caldwell, in a rare 1979 interview with Time magazine, expressed this ambivalence: "We have spent our lives being studied, analyzed, discussed. Our bodies were treated as texts for science to read. Our stories, as warnings to be told. I do not deny the importance of what medicine learned from us, nor the value of alerting other communities to the dangers of consanguinity. But sometimes, we just wish to be." The early 1980s marked a new phase for the Caldwell women, characterized by reconciliation efforts and a search for a positive legacy. In 1982, Martha Caldwell, then 49, established the Caldwell Foundation for Genetic Awareness, a non-profit dedicated to educating isolated rural communities about consanguinity risks. The foundation produced simple, accessible educational materials with clear illustrations and explanations of basic genetics, distributed in isolated Appalachian regions with the help of community health workers and local religious leaders. "We are not here to judge or condemn traditions," Martha often explained in her presentations. "We are here to share information that was not available to our family. Knowledge that could have prevented so much suffering." While difficult to quantify, anecdotal reports suggest these efforts contributed to reducing the incidence of close relative marriages in several communities, helping destigmatize discussion of consanguinity as a public health topic. In 1983, Martha testified before a congressional subcommittee on rural health. Her eloquent testimony on the long-term consequences of geographical isolation and lack of access to healthcare and education helped secure federal funding for medical extension programs in remote Appalachian regions. "The mountains that isolated us are not just geographical, but economic and social," she told legislators. "To break the cycle of isolation that leads to practices like those that destroyed my family, we need to build bridges, not just physical ones, but bridges of knowledge, care, and understanding." While Martha dedicated herself to public activism, other survivors chose different paths. Ruth Caldwell, uncomfortable with public attention, found purpose working with blind children. Using her own experience of vision-free navigation, she became a respected instructor at a Nashville school for the blind. In a 1984 interview with a local newspaper, Ruth reflected, "For a long time, I saw my condition only as a curse, a burden I carried due to my ancestors' mistakes. But through my work with these children, I began to see my experience as a source of unique wisdom. I can teach from a place of genuine understanding that other instructors, however dedicated, simply do not possess." In 1985, a significant event brought the Caldwell survivors back to national attention. Dr. James Harrison, a neurologist specializing in sensory perception, published a groundbreaking study on the extraordinary auditory and tactile abilities developed by the sightless Caldwell women. His study, published in Nature, documented how these women had repurposed areas of the cerebral cortex typically dedicated to visual processing to amplify other senses. Brain scans of Martha, Ruth, and 3 other Caldwell survivors revealed neural activity patterns challenging prior understandings of brain plasticity and sensory adaptation. Dr. Harrison concluded the women had effectively rewired their brains in response to their congenital condition, developing sensory abilities rivaling or exceeding those documented in individuals who lost vision later in life. The Caldwell brain became an important case study in neuroplasticity. Ever pragmatic, Martha commented on these findings in an interview with Scientific American. "It is a comfort to know something useful for science has come from our pain. But let us be clear, no scientific discovery is worth the price our family paid. Given the choice, I would exchange all this scientific knowledge for a normal childhood for each of us." In 1987, an unexpected development added another layer to the complex Caldwell history. A 25-year-old woman named Rebecca Miller contacted the Caldwell Foundation, claiming to be a descendant of Sarah Caldwell, the aunt who had warned authorities in 1943. According to Rebecca, her grandmother Sarah had left Tennessee after the incident, settled out west, changed her name, and rarely spoke of her past. Only on her deathbed in 1986 did Sarah reveal her true identity and give Rebecca a diary she had kept during her years with the Caldwells. Sarah's diary, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archive, offered an extraordinary window into daily life within the isolated Caldwell community during the 1920s and 30s. Meticulously handwritten, it detailed not only the family's consanguineous practices but also the complex belief system sustaining them. Sarah described how Jedediah Caldwell had developed an idiosyncratic theology blending elements of fundamentalist Christianity, Appalachian folk traditions, and his own mystical interpretations, positioning the Caldwells as a chosen lineage whose blood must remain undiluted. Particularly disturbing were Sarah's accounts of how the eyeless women were treated. Far from hidden or neglected, they were celebrated as inner seers, venerated for their perceived spiritual insight. This veneration, however, coexisted with their exploitation as perpetuators of the sacred lineage, a euphemism for their role in arranged, consanguineous unions. The diary also revealed Sarah had attempted to warn authorities multiple times before 1943, but was ignored. Only when Eliza's forced marriage to her uncle was imminent, scheduled within a week, did Sarah make her desperate escape. The edited publication of the diary in 1988, titled Witness in the Valley, The Diary of Sarah Caldwell, became a national bestseller, inspiring renewed discussion on cultural isolation, patriarchal authority, and the role of women in closed communities. It also provoked debate on authorities' responsibility to intervene in harmful cultural practices, even within resistant, isolated communities. For Martha and the other survivors, Sarah's diary offered late validation. For decades, we struggled for people to believe the extent and systematic nature of what happened in our valley, Martha commented upon the book's release. Sarah's diary confirms what we always knew, but also reveals how much sooner our tragedy could have been interrupted if someone had only listened. By the late 1980s, the Caldwell case had moved from obscurity to the canon of case studies in medical genetics, neuroscience, and cultural anthropology. The survivors, now elderly, had found various ways to reconcile with their pasts and build meaningful lives despite their trauma. Martha Caldwell continued her foundation work until her death in 1991 at age 60. Her funeral was attended not only by the few remaining survivors but also by dozens of medical professionals, researchers, and activists whose careers and perspectives had been deeply influenced by her work. Her New York Times obituary described her as a woman who transformed a dark inheritance into a mission of illumination, stating her legacy lived on not only in medical genetics, where the Caldwell case remains a seminal study, but in the numerous families that, thanks to her educational efforts, were spared similar suffering. Ruth Caldwell continued her work with blind children until retiring in 1994, receiving multiple recognitions for her pioneering contributions to sensory teaching techniques. She died in 1998 at age 59, leaving a legacy of pedagogical innovation that continues to influence the education of visually impaired children. Scientific discoveries related to the case continued in subsequent decades. In 1995, University of Michigan researchers precisely identified the specific genetic mutation, a deletion in the SOX3 gene affecting early eye development, responsible for the Caldwell women's anophthalmia, significantly contributing to understanding human ocular embryology. In 2002, a comprehensive study by geneticist Dr. Lawrence Klein analyzed the DNA of over 200 indirect Caldwell descendants across the United States. The study revealed approximately 1 in 40 residents of certain Appalachian regions carries the Caldwell mutation in recessive form, a silent testament to the dispersion of family genes through subsequent generations. The Caldwell case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, scientific ignorance, and harmful traditions perpetuated in the name of purity or preservation. Yet it is also a story of extraordinary human resilience, adaptation, and the ability to transform personal suffering into societal progress. The women born without eyes in the Appalachians, victims of generations of consanguinity, ultimately found ways to see beyond the limitations imposed by their genetics and culture. Through their testimonies, activism, and simply through lives lived with dignity, they illuminated dark corners of the human experience and contributed to a more informed and compassionate world. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "watched here" so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates these channel stories. If you're not yet subscribed, now is the perfect time to join our community and discover more amazing, impactful narratives like this one. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of human experience. Don't forget to like and share with friends who enjoy real, impactful histories. The mountains hold many more secrets, and we will be here to reveal them to you, one chapter at a time.